With us, our very own Stuart Nixon, who will be with us for, what, 2 weeks,
and then the third week, Errol.
Errol Moore will be coming in to pick up on the same conversation, but Stuart will be leading us in a discussion on archaeology and the Exodus, right? What we know, and I guess what we don't know also.
Yes, indeed.
All righty, thank you.
Oh, good morning. I didn't expect to have an eyewitness in the audience. He might want to be the better person.
Primary source.
I want to try something different this morning, and it may or may not work. I want to play you a little song. Actually, it's part of a song. But now my boombox is not what you call hi-fi. But let me give it a try here, and we'll see if it works. And I'll have to turn up the volume. By the way, if you don't understand the lyrics, don't worry about it, because I'm going to tell you what they are after it's over. Okay?
Must be in Hebrew.
Remember how I'm doing this. There we go.
There you go, looks like it started.
There we go.
I see some red, there you go.
It's a toe tapper. Oh. Start over. Let's do something about that. The Bible will take care of it. Okay. You know something? That's not the right place. Okay, we'll try again. I think what happened, it remembered where I stopped. This is worth it, by the way. Okay, I'm not going to waste your time. Anyway, this is a Bruce Springsteen song, a folk song, and I'm going to read you the lyrics and you'll understand. The song is Mary, Don't You Weep.
Oh.
You know this one. Mary, oh Mary, don't you weep no more. Yeah, I mean, a lot of verses out of the Bible. But the first 4 verses are the one I picked for you to hear. If I can get it working, I'll play it next week. The first verse, he says, well, if I could, I surely would stand on the rock where Moses stood. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you weep. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Actually, the refrain says, oh, Mary, don't. I always thought the refrain was, oh, Mary, don't you weep no more. It's actually, oh, Mary, don't you weep, comma, don't mourn. I didn't know that. Oh, Mary, don't weep, don't mourn. Okay, the next verse is, well, Mary wore 3 links of chain. On every link was Jesus' name. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Third verse, well, one of these nights, about 12 o'clock, this old world is gonna rock. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. And the last, well, Moses stood on the Red Sea shore and smote the water with a 2x4. Don't you love it? Well, the idea, obviously, is to get us into this whole subject in a way that you might not have expected. Because this whole story of the Exodus shows up in all kinds of unexpected places in our culture. Yes, it's quintessentially a biblical story, but it has become bigger than that. And that's one reason I think it's of particular interest to talk about. For me, there are three basic reasons why I've sort of stuck with this, studied this, and continue to study it, by the way. There's a lot to study in the Exodus, as you can imagine. The first reason is that this is not just a biblical story, it is the biblical story, at least in the Old Testament, because it is the birthing narrative of the Jewish people. This is where they claim their origins. And therefore, by extension, it's our birthing story. It's the birthing story of Christianity. If you remember when we talked about Herod's temple, we drew a direct theological line from the Exodus to the ministry of Jesus. There is that continuity there that's unbroken. So it becomes our story, even though it's their story. The second reason I find this interesting is that it's possible to know something so well you don't actually know it at all. You ever thought about that idea? You can be so familiar with something, it's so much a part of you, you never stop to ask any questions about it. I mean, why would you? You grew up with it. There it is, that's the way. Not too long ago, I came across a book review, and the title grabbed me. I haven't looked at the book yet, it doesn't matter. The title of the book is The Illusion of Attention. Subtitle, What We Miss When We Think We See Everything. And that kind of gets you. Well, that's what I want to talk about with you. Is it possible we've looked at this story so many times we actually don't even see it or see everything that's there? Is that possible? And the last reason, number three, this is the difficult one. I don't know any way to talk about the Exodus without talking about the way we think about and talk about the Bible as the Word of God. In other words, each of us has a certain perception of what the text means to us, the way we think about it, to read it, study it, ponder it, maybe discuss it with somebody else, etc. We filter, so to speak. Well, scholars have the same problem. How do they approach the text? And they have come up with a kind of systematic way to do it, or call it a frame of reference if you like. And I want to share that with you because I think we need to try to do the same thing, try to share that same frame of reference and see if it works for us. This part's not too complicated, but you'll see how it can get complicated. I've given you a little chart here. You'll notice on the right, I've put the word max, and on the left, min, M-I-N, and then between them, a line. What we have here is a scale, or a spectrum, if you want to call it, of ways to think about the Bible. The max is really a reference to a maximalist. A maximalist. A scholar, you'll see these terms all the time. Scholars will say, well, this point of view is a maximalist point of view, a person who takes a maximalist point of view. And I'll explain that in a minute. Obviously, then min is short for minimalist, a minimalist. Now, what's the difference? The maximalist says that the Bible, because it's the Word of God, is absolutely historically correct. It cannot contain error. It cannot contain inconsistency. It cannot leave something out or put something in that doesn't belong there. It's perfect. That's the most extreme maximalist position you can take. Very familiar position. Some of you may share it. Clearly, there's a lot of publicity for folks who take that position. I have put max on the right because it is the most conservative position you can take on interpretation of the Bible. The opposite of it are the minimalists, who say, no, it's a human product, the Bible is a human product, inspired, yes, but still, by virtue of being human, subject to all the problems that various texts have. Inconsistencies, errors, something put in, something left out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the two most extreme positions. Now, just to keep this thing rolling along and not to make it too complicated, I will tell you that the vast majority of scholars, biblical scholars, Jewish, Christians, anything else, do not fall at either extreme. There are definitely some perfectly respected scholars at the minimalist side. I've read some of their papers, and likewise on the maximalist side. I've read some of their papers. So yes, if you find yourself pulled in one direction or the other, you will find perfectly good academic research in your area of interest. But far and away, right now, we've got scholars who are somewhere in between those 2 points of view, based on their research. If they come up with findings that seem to lean one way or the other, then they might say, well, I'm kind of in the minimalist camp, or I'm kind of in the other camp. But that only means that their evidence is pointing them in that direction. It doesn't mean it's all black over here and all white over here, okay? Lots of gray when it comes to trying to take archaeology and other scholarly fields of study and focus them on the Bible. That's the, and this is the way it's working now in modern biblical scholarship. You'll read paper after paper after paper, and you'll see people saying, you know, this is where the evidence is pointing me. A lot of peer discussion, a lot of debate. How should we approach this? Well, like any scholar or historian or journalist, there's always those good old-fashioned 5 W's, the 5 questions: who, what, when, where, and why. Well, I want to take that approach and pick some of those to talk about. We won't be able to hit all of them with respect to the Exodus, so we don't have enough time. You'll see very quickly why that's the case. So I'm just going to arbitrarily pick some that seem to give us good insight into the way scholars have been working with the Exodus in recent years, 20th century research particularly. Who, what, when, where, and why. The first one I want to pick is the dating of the Exodus. This is tricky. This is very tricky. To try to walk you through this, there are 2 basic theories that seem to have gotten the greatest amount of attention when it comes to when did the Exodus actually take place. Now you notice this is not a challenge to its existence, which would be minimalist. It never happened, and there are perfectly competent people who said it never happened at all. But this is not a challenge. The dating is saying, okay, there's a lot of information in the Bible about this. Can we find anything outside of the Bible and put those 2 things together and come up with some kind of estimate of when it actually happened? The first theory, now there's not a name for this, so I'm just going to give you information. Oh, wait a minute, let me tell you something else. Almost forgot. This will be of interest. What's difficult, one reason it's so difficult to answer these 5 questions about the Exodus is that there are 2 missing pieces of information. Every scholar acknowledges this. This is not controversial. There are 2 pieces of information which are being debated as we speak. They've been debated for years in the scholarly community. The first is, the Bible does not name the Pharaoh who oppressed the Hebrew slaves. The Bible does not tell us. No source tells us. The Jewish scholars of all people would love to know. They didn't remember. This is a real enigma. Because when you think about it, the people you hate are the people you're most likely to remember. I mean, let's be honest. Who would remember Pontius Pilate if it wasn't for us? Pilate was a minor Roman figure. Look where he was assigned. Palestine, backwater in the Roman Empire. Not something you put on your resume. But he is remembered, right? He is remembered. And we could cite, I suppose, other examples. Maybe the person who bullied you in high school or elementary school, you probably have never forgotten good old whoever, right? The Jews do not remember the name of the Pharaoh, and the Bible doesn't tell us. The other problem is that the Jews themselves do not know who they are. They cannot tell you ethnically who they are. Where did they come from? There are a lot of DNA studies currently in progress that hope to resolve this. But there's paper after paper after paper on who are the Israelites. Who are the Hebrews? These are scholarly papers, not just some, lay person like me. So we have these two issues that just haunt this whole subject of the Exodus. If only we knew the Pharaoh, we wouldn't have to struggle with dating. We wouldn't have to struggle with all the details in the story about the enslavement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, we don't even know who the Hebrews are, the slaves. What part of the Middle East did they actually come from? All we know is they came from the north. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Okay, back to the dating. There are two theories. The first theory is, it turns out there is actually a number in the Bible which professes to tell us exactly when the Exodus occurred. What's interesting is that it's not in the book of Exodus. It's in the book of Kings. And I'll read it to you. It's very short. Kings chapter 6, verse 1, right up front. In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the house of the Lord, Solomon's temple. Familiar story. But here it's dated. In the 480th year after the Exodus, Solomon started to build his temple, and that was the 4th year of his reign. Now, the maximalists will say, well, why are you worrying about this? It's right there. Holy Scripture. Why is there any debate about the dating? Well, I'll tell you. Now, I didn't put all this on the board for you. It's easier if I had all these numbers here. But I'm going to try to give you a little sense of this. First of all, we know approximately when Solomon lived, as we know his father, David, right? We can pretty well date the two reigns of of David and Solomon. They both occurred in the 900s BC. 900s BC. The reign, and depending on which source you go to, you might get some variation in the dates because these chronologies are somewhat subjected to variation depending on the archaeology and other studies. But the best, one of the best reigns I came up with, time frames I came up with for Solomon, is 962, approximately 962 to 922. 962 to 922 BC. That would be his reign. Okay. You notice that's a 40-year period. I'll just remind you of that, 40 years. If we back that, say 4 years after he came to the throne, that puts it at 958 BC when he started building the temple. If we take the 480 and add it to that 958, that pushes us back. Remember, we have to add to go back in time. That puts the Exodus at 1438 BC. So we go from the mid-900s all the way back, almost 500 years, to the mid-1400s to get the date of the Exodus. That's theory number one, based on the Bible. So that would be a maximalist position. Now, you say, well, what could possibly be wrong here? There are some concerns, let's phrase it that way. Because this is not a case of people throwing mud at each other. This is a case of competent scientists, not scientists, scholars, trying to wrestle, like Jacob with the angels, struggling with material that's very, shall we say, piecemeal. The number 480 bothers scholars, and the reason is that Jews love numbers. They load numbers up with meaning, layers of meaning. So anytime you pick up a number from the Old Testament, you've got to kind of think about it. Why did the writer use that number? Because the Bible is not necessarily a news report. It's not necessarily a textbook, right? I mean, we can kind of understand that idea. So if you bump into a number which seems to have reoccurring importance in the Old Testament, you stop and say, am I really understanding it correctly? Scholars have pointed out that the number 480 is divisible by 40. I mentioned 40 a minute ago. 40 is a very important number in the Jewish heritage. The Exodus, how many years? Just as a start. If you divide 40 into 480, what do you get? 12. Another very important number. How many disciples? 12. How many tribes? 12. You get the point. Now, you say, well, maybe we're being suspicious here for no reason. Well, you can read the papers as well as I can. I mean, this obviously gets off into many complications that we don't have time for now. It just means that maybe there's something here, something going on here, linguistically, or even in terms of the actual meaning that we're missing, that we shouldn't take this literally, okay? But if we don't take it literally, what do we do with it? Well, there's something else that I'm going to tell you about, because every scholar places great importance on this when it comes to the issue of dating. And happily, it's beyond controversy. One of the few things in archaeology that's beyond controversy. And that is, and I'm going to have to write this for you, I think. I'm going to write this because me pronouncing it is not going to be very helpful. It's the name of a person, Merneptah, M-E-R. Let me be sure I did it right. Merneptah. It's the name of a person, a pharaoh. And as you know, an Egyptian pharaoh. Now you know the Egyptian pharaohs loved to build things. And they did that because they were bragging. That's what it was. They almost always put up something which said, look at us, look at our glorious accomplishments. Well, actually, this is a case where egos are most welcome, because it means archaeologists have something to dig up. And you dig up with skepticism, because you know that's what's coming, but it doesn't mean it's not informative. It doesn't mean it's fiction. It could be just exaggeration. Probably is exaggeration. But you know these beautiful, if you've studied Egyptian history, you know these beautiful pictures of all the monuments, the walls, and all the works that have come out of Egypt over a century of archaeology there. Very detailed work. And they use hieroglyphics mostly, which are pictorial, which are pictorial alphabet. They're not just symbols. You can make some sense out of the pictures even if you don't know what the rest of the symbol means. So it's a rich source of information. A monument, there's a certain type of monument that's called a stele. I didn't bring a picture of it. I can't even give you the dimensions of it. But one of the monuments that was uncovered in Egypt, in a temple, I believe it was, is referred to as the Merneptah stele. Because what he has done, he erected this thing to brag about all of his military achievements, his victories, his ability to put down the bad guys. And he has this quite a list on this thing of all of these peoples that he went and conquered. One of the groups of people that he names is Israel. He says, I laid them waste, I killed them all, vanquished them, they disappeared off the face of the earth. Israel. It is the first known reference to Israel in the archaeological record. Nobody has found anything earlier than that. It's our first proof that there was a group of people. Now this is an ethnic reference, it's not a geographical reference. It's an ethnic reference to a group of people who have this identity. They call themselves Israel. And it dates to no earlier than 1210 BC. Sometime between 1210 and 1205 BC is the window for dating the Merneptah stele. You can read books, you can read papers, you can hear lectures, you can see documentaries on Egyptian history or Jewish history, and this gets referenced because it's so exciting. It's like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is something physical, tangible, untouched, came right out of the earth, and there it's all written. Everything he claims he did. And he mentions Israel. We now have the nation of Israel. Now, is nation 100 people or is it 10,000 people? Whole other issue. But we have proof that these folks were there. And he even tells us where he found them, and it was Canaan. Now, you know the map, I think. Well, you do. Of course you do. Some of you have been there. Here's Canaan right here at the edge of the Mediterranean. Here's the Sinai Peninsula, and here's Egypt with the Nile River. Okay? That's the setup. And we know that Egypt went up into Canaan and militarily and took control of it. So again, that makes that part fits with the historical record. We're on safe ground historically. So now we've got this problem. We now know that the Exodus had to have occurred prior to the stele, because we already have a people who call themselves Israel. And the Exodus was the event that gave rise to that, the birthing narrative. The unknown here is how much back in time do we have to go to get the Exodus? We have to go before 1250 BC, because we have to add in the 40 years for the wandering in the wilderness. So it actually had to have occurred not only before 12, it had to occur before 1250 BC. And realistically, we know it had to have occurred long before 1250, because you can't have a group of slaves coming into Canaan and settling and suddenly pulling themselves together into this unified group of people with an identity, calling themselves Israel or calling themselves anything else. That process of self-awareness must have taken a long and convoluted time, a period of time. So we have to keep backing up, you see, to somehow fit the Exodus into the scheme. But we always have to make it consistent with the stele, because the stele is beyond dispute. Okay. So how do we do this? Well, we know, for example, if we go way back to the 1600s BC, that Egypt had this problem of foreigners coming in for a variety of reasons. And in particular, there were some people from the far north who came in gradually, incrementally, and settled in Egypt and slowly built up the numbers and the influence until in the 1700s, be sure to get you right, I'm sorry, they came in the 1700s, and then I have to come, time is working the other way. They slowly infiltrated in the 1700s, and then by the mid-1600s BC, they were actually able to seize control of the Egyptian government. 1600s, mid-1600s BC. And they dominated the land for over a century. The historians refer to these people as the Hyksos. And you'll see this name a lot if you study Egyptian history. The Hyksos. They were not appreciated. They were not appreciated. Finally, about 1540 is the date, typical date, BC, the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt, and the Egyptians took control once again of their own country and established what historians refer to as the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom. And that's the period of time that continues right up to the stealing. So we've got a considerable period of time from the mid-1500s up to the early 1200s BC. That's a considerable period of time. And therefore, the maximalist argument that the Exodus took place in the 1400s fits perfectly in that time frame. It's such a big time frame. So now, the argument is shifting, you see, to the right on the dating. Even though we had this question of the numbers, 480, should that be taken literally and so forth? Well, now we got another issue that comes up. If it took 480 years, if it took from the New Kingdom, from the mid-1500s up until the late 1200s, for the nation of Israel to evolve, that's a long time. Why isn't there another reference to Israel earlier than this? That's a long period of silence that bothers the scholars. Why is the stele the oldest? Why can't we go back further and find more references if this nation of Israel, coming out of the Exodus, was so old by the time of this stele? Several centuries. See the issue? Now, there's an explanation for this, but it leads us to theory 2 when it comes to the dating. And this time we have to go back to the Bible. Make sure I give you these references correctly. This time we can go to the book of Exodus. Okay, this is Exodus chapter 1, right to the beginning, verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. You remember Joseph, that whole story. He did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So the Pharaoh now has apparently a numerical problem. So what does he do? Therefore, they, the Egyptians, set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, S-T-O-R-E, store cities. And they are named Pithom and Ramesses. So now the Bible is giving us very specific information that these people who seem to be multiplying at a rate that alarms the Egyptians, they're not Egyptians, they're Egyptians by birth, because they've been there a while. Remember, Joseph got there, and we're talking about his descendants, and maybe some others, we don't know. But they're growing in population, and so Egyptian side, they got to enslave them. That's the way to contain them. They'll work them to death, is what it kind of comes down to. And they were assigned to work in two cities, Pithom and Ramses. For a long time, scholars did not know where these cities were located or even if they existed at all. But a lot of good archaeology has been done. In fact, this map is already out of date. It's the biggest map I could find so that you all could see it. But there's some sites on here which have been excavated which are not identified here, but I'm going to show you where they are. Now we know a lot about now we know a lot about these two cities. But for this to make sense, we have to go back a little bit. Remember now, this is the new kingdom, one pharaoh after the next. The big clue here is the name of the first one, Ramses, because there were two, well, more than that actually. There were multiple pharaohs who used that name. The first one was Ramesses, and it can be Ramses or Ramesses, doesn't matter. The first Ramesses was Ramesses the first, took office in 1295 BC. 1295. We're in the 1200s now. He was only in office 1 year. His son succeeded him, was in office for 15 years. Then he was succeeded by his son, Ramesses II. Ramesses II is one of the most prominent figures in Egyptian history because he reigned for 66 years. Now imagine what you can build in 66 years with slave labor. Not to mention your own craftsmen and the people in your own administration, your architects and so forth. And Ramesses II had a son, Meneptah. So it's all kind of coming together, you see. We now have a window, if you will, an historical framework with which we can work, or in which we can work, with some confidence. And we have these two cities. Ramesses was the capital that Ramesses II decided to build for himself. He was building all over Kingdom Come. He loved statues of himself. He loved monuments to himself. You can go home and spend the rest of the afternoon on the internet reading about this guy. Fascinating. Let me see what I wrote down here about him. By the way, his name means fashioned by the sun god, Re. Okay? He was 25 years old when he took over. He was married 8 times. He squeezed in some time to build some things, but he was married 8 times. Now, this one source, I should have written down the source where I got this. He built more temples, erected more obelisks, and sired more sons and daughters than any other pharaoh before or after. There probably should be a documentary about this guy or something. Anyway, he decided to build a capital, and here it is. I put a little red arrow, Ramesses. Now there are other names for these sites. The scholars will use other names for sites, and you'll see this frequently. They pair up one name and with another one for various reasons. We don't have to get into all that. That's right here. Now you'll notice where we are. We're in the delta, the Egyptian delta. It's called the Lower Egypt because the water flows from south to north and empties into the Mediterranean, like the Shenandoah River. So we know who built it, the city, and when he built it. So we now have the Bible telling us that he used slaves, the Hebrew slaves, on this project. The other city is Pithom, which is, it's not on this map, but it's right near Ramesses, and it was a capital earlier. It was another city. So now we've got very strong evidence that the Exodus did not take place in the 1400s, that it took place later, 200 years later, in the 1200s, under Ramesses II. That would be the unnamed, he would be the unnamed Pharaoh. So this is potentially of tremendous interest to scholars, that those two cities, store cities where you store your commodities for various reasons, your resources, particularly food, where the pharaohs could store food. The New Kingdom was a very successful period in Egyptian history. Well, you can imagine he was pharaoh for 66 years and he had all these projects going on. So now we've got these two competing theories. The 1200s, the Ramesses theory, is definitely leaning this way, because it says the number, the 480, is not to be taken literally. So you see how these, we go one way or the other, okay? All right, that gives you a good taste of the archaeological difficulties that we have here. Oh, by the way, the mummy of Ramesses II has been found.
Oh.
And you can view it in Egypt. It's in a museum. Now, the problem is we've got to be sure, or we'd like to be sure, that the slaves that Ramesses utilized were in fact Hebrews. See, that's a whole separate problem. Can we put, historically, Hebrews in Egypt in the New Kingdom? And this is complicated. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can pursue this. But clearly the description in the Bible is consistent with what Ramesses II was doing. That part we can go along with. Because the Bible mentions that Joseph came to Goshen, and Goshen is this area right here, exactly where the two store cities are located. Okay, I'm just throwing out information for you. It's a little disjointed, I realize. And we can go on and on. That's the trouble. Because scholars really worked hard on this. It's interesting that the threat here to Egypt seems to be the birth rate of the Hebrews. That they're afraid that an outside power, like remember the Hyksos who came in and just, it was traumatic. Nobody's forgotten the Hyksos. That taught Egypt a lesson, because once the New Kingdom came in, pushing out the Hyksos, what the Egyptian government did was, the first thing it did is start building forts. And it built forts right along the water, because this is the way the Hyksos came in. So it built all this chain of forts. And the theory is that the forts were separated by a day's walk. They were very strategic about this. And so they had garrisons all up and down here. They also took some other measures to protect themselves. Let's see.
Got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. They did other things on the border with their neighbors over here in Sinai. And they also adopted a standing army, all because of the Hyksos. So we have Egypt that is not paranoid necessarily, but very security-minded. But we also have this phenomenon of non-threatening people being admitted to Egypt, because Egypt was such a prosperous place. And it was so hard. This is wilderness, and there's this huge Arabian desert out here. So it's a very difficult place for these various ethnic groups to survive. And it was inevitable, like Joseph, who ended up in Egypt, for people, particularly nomadic people, Bedouin and that type, to come into Egypt and hope to be admitted. And in many cases they were allowed in. And there are records about this. We don't have to speculate. There are records. The Egyptians retained records saying who they were letting in and who they were not. And you can read all about this. So, I said to you that the Jews don't know who they are. And so this is where we run into this whole problem. And we don't have to make a big deal out of this. There are various groups that are named in various historical sources, but none of them seem to fit exactly what we would want to identify the Hebrews. All we can say is apparently the Hebrews were Canaanites. Whatever that might mean. They apparently were people who had settled in this. Today this is Palestine. The Romans called it Palestine. You heard the name in the Bible is Canaan. Okay, right along in here. Today it's Israel, of course. Not exclusively, because Lebanon is up here and Syria and so on and so on. Okay. Let me turn to another topic. Well, 10 minutes, say, a little less than 10 minutes. Are there any questions before I jump into something else? Yes, sir.
Are you using the term Hebrews and Jews interchangeably?
No.
Or the Hebrews, and then you said the Hebrews are in Egypt before the Exodus. So the Jews were Jews before they became Jews.
Yeah, that's right. Did you hear that? Everybody hear the question? Is the word Jew and the word Hebrews the same thing? And I'm glad you asked that. The answer is absolutely not. The Jews do not exist as an identifiable group for centuries. What I did, one lecture I went to, and I asked a Jewish scholar, what was the language of the Ten Commandments? Moses was an Egyptian. His father was an Egyptian. His grandfather was an Egyptian. All the Hebrews grew up Egyptian. They were not ethnically Egyptian, but they grew up Egyptian, surrounded by the culture. And he said, well, I can tell you what it was not. The Ten Commandments were not written in Hebrew. Ooh. I mean, wouldn't you kind of assume they were written in Hebrew? Well, I said, then what were they? He said, we don't know for sure. There must have been some kind of dialect that we can call Proto-Hebrew. Something that they understood. Was it a mix of Egyptian and something else? I mean, we can get off into, these are linguistic studies, which are way beyond me. I'll be totally honest with you. But that gives us our first clue that there was nothing we could call a cohesive group of people with one identity. That's why this stele is so momentous for scholars, because it's the first indication that somehow these disparate people from Canaan had come back together in some way and now thought of themselves as one. And thus the Exodus story becomes their narrative. Only theirs. The Jewish scholars, I mean, they say, what is special here? What is special here is that we're different. Our God made us different from what all the other gods did. Abraham was not a monotheist, remember.
How many Hebrews, Jews, were actually in the Exodus? What's the accepted? I mean, was it hundreds of thousands, or?
And the color to that, how long did it Exodus take to all these Jews to go to Egypt to?
Not Jews, Hebrews.
Yeah.
The term Jew doesn't come into use until much
I
later.
understand.
Okay. I'm going to have to do something absolutely awful and not answer your question. Because that's the next topic.
Okay.
I will, to be fair, not to tease you, this is horribly complicated. This is where, and I'm going to be very upfront with you, this is where the minimalists have a much, much stronger position than the maximalists. So you're going to have to be open next week to the possibility that the Bible is incorrect. Or at least cannot be taken literally. which is not the same as being incorrect. It can be completely correct, but simply not a news report. That's what most scholars would say.
So Ramesses took power at age 25 and served for 66 years, so he was 91 when he died?
Was not what?
91 years old when he died?
Oh,
25 plus the 60.
25, I guess so. I didn't actually write down. Right. And I don't know from memory.
It's a long time to live back in those days.
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal.
He was well fed.
I will let you speculate about how he managed that.
Did they count years the same back then as we do today?
Maybe you should get more wives.
365
Well,
days?
we are doing that for scholars are doing that, yes, trying to translate whatever that calendar was into a calendar we can
She's
understand.
leaning back.
So when it says like 480 years, is that 480 years as we would think of it, or is that some sort of different calculation?
No, that would be as we would calculate it. This is where I'm over my head. Egyptologists really have to struggle with this. How do you measure time?
Stuart, many years ago when I took archaeology, we were taught or hypothesized that in about 1440, that's when Thera, the volcano Thera in the island of Santorini erupted. And that caused such a tsunami in that area that they speculated at that time that that could have been the source of the Red Sea story. Has that been totally disproved?
Let me see if I can give you a short answer to this. Most of the scholars that I work, that I consult, are very reluctant to try to explain supernatural events in natural terms. For all kinds of reasons. I mean, you can understand. They have so much to work with historical information, to try to get beyond historical information and somehow deal in what you're talking about. But there are plenty of people who are very happy to speculate and try to link natural events to seemingly supernatural events. But very few of the scholars are going to try to take all the plagues in the Exodus story and say, well, that was that, and that was that. Plenty of people, you can buy books that will do that. Does that mean that you can't make such a judgment? No. It just means that it's getting us off into so many speculative areas that you quickly lose data to work with.
But that would tie it more into the 1400s, the Exodus into the theory of the 1400s.
That part works.
Yeah.
And every time somebody comes up with something like this, there's always a counter. So you and I can spend the rest of our life, well, you know, did this cause the Red Sea, or did something else, or is that a myth, or, you know. But that's the short answer, that there's no, you just aren't going to see scholars getting all excited about that.
Yeah.
It's just too troublesome.
The other oil in the fire is that the Red Sea is easily 100 miles south of where the most likely crossing would have been. And in those days, before the canal was dug, it was a swamp, albeit, but it was not a sea. I mean, you could walk across it. And
Right.
so if they really crossed the Red Sea, it would be well down past Port Said. And,
Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard that. This is a major argument about the word Red Sea. Not all of the early translators used that term. The alternative term is the Reed Sea, R-E-E-D. The Reed Sea would be up here.
Would be up north.
The Red Sea is down here,
Yeah.
at least in the modern world. Now, the maximalists will say, no, you're making a man out of a molehill. These are primitive people, we're talking a long time ago, and they could just as easily have called this red as they called it reed. See, so there's a workaround. It's a no-win situation. Historically, this is not the Red Sea. Is it conceivable that the writer of in the Old Testament just used that term as some kind of umbrella term? Well, yes, that is conceivable. So there's no way to actually resolve that. But scholars will tell you it really means the Reed Sea, which is not a sea at all. It's a marshy area.
Yeah, Stuart.
Okay.
Sorry, it's all very interesting, but it's,
Whoa.
time has come. Until next week.
Thank you.
Recovering.